The September rain fell in steady sheets across Evergreen Cemetery, each drop seeming to mirror the tears that Maria Elena Rodriguez couldn't bring herself to shed publicly. At 45, she stood apart from the cluster of black-clad mourners surrounding Margaret Whitmore's mahogany casket, her weathered hands clutching a simple bouquet of yellow roses that Margaret had loved from their shared garden. The expensive floral arrangements from high-end florists dwarfed her humble offering, just as the designer mourning attire of the family made her simple black dress from Target appear shabby in comparison. Have any of you ever felt like an outsider at what should have been your own family gathering? Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're watching from, because this story of family betrayal could happen anywhere, and Maria's struggle is about to become something far more complex than simple grief. Bradley Whitmore stood at the center of the family cluster, his 6-foot frame impeccably dressed in a charcoal Armani suit that cost more than Maria's monthly Social Security check. At 35, he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never questioned his place in the world, his steel-gray eyes surveying the funeral proceedings like a CEO reviewing quarterly reports. His voice carried easily across the cemetery as he spoke to the other mourners, each word carefully modulated to project both grief and authority. "Mother always said family comes first," he announced to the gathered crowd, his gaze deliberately avoiding Maria's direction. She believed in protecting what matters most, ensuring that her legacy remains with those who truly understood her values. Stephanie Whitmorchin positioned herself strategically beside her older brother, her perfectly styled auburn hair remaining immaculate despite the persistent drizzle. At 32, she possessed the sharp-featured beauty of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted, her navy Chanel suit and matching Louboutin pumps making a statement about status even at a graveside service. As a senior associate at Morrison, Bradley & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms, she had learned to wield legal terminology like a weapon, and her green eyes held the calculating gleam of someone already 3 moves ahead in whatever game she was playing. "The legal aspects of Mother's estate are quite straightforward," she mentioned casually to a family friend, her voice carrying just loud enough for Maria to overhear. When someone lives in a house without formal legal standing, the transition period is typically quite brief. Connor Whitmore, the youngest at 28, shifted uncomfortably in his expensive Italian leather shoes, his boyish features twisted into an expression of poorly concealed impatience. Despite his considerable height and athletic build from his college rowing days, he carried himself with the fidgety energy of someone accustomed to instant gratification and digital solutions. His tech startup had made him wealthy in his own right, but his blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed human relationships as networks to be optimized rather than bonds to be treasured. "I've already spoken with our property management consultant," he said quietly to Bradley, his voice taking on the clipped efficiency he used in board meetings. "The house should be listed within the week, maybe 2 at most to handle any administrative details." Maria found herself remembering the countless evenings she had spent in that very house, helping Margaret navigate her final years with dignity and grace. For 8 years, she had been more than a daughter-in-law or stepmother. She had been Margaret's companion, confidant, and primary caregiver as arthritis and failing health gradually confined the older woman to her bedroom. The memories felt surreal now, standing 20 feet away from Margaret's biological children who spoke about their mother's legacy while ignoring the woman who had actually lived it day by day. The irony wasn't lost on Maria that these people who couldn't be bothered to visit their mother more than twice a year were now positioning themselves as the guardians of her memory. The funeral service itself had been a masterclass in social theater, with each of Margaret's children delivering carefully crafted eulogies that painted pictures of a relationship that Maria knew had existed only in their imaginations. Bradley spoke movingly about family traditions and shared values, conveniently omitting his mother's frequent phone calls complaining about his absence and emotional distance. Stephanie recounted childhood memories with the polished delivery of a closing argument, her stories carefully edited to remove any reference to the years of neglect that had characterized her adult relationship with Margaret. Connor's tribute focused on his mother's strength and independence, apparently forgetting the 2 years when that same independence had required around-the-clock care that he had been too busy to provide. As the service concluded and the crowd began to disperse toward the line of luxury vehicles parked along the cemetery's main drive, Maria felt a firm hand grip her elbow with unnecessary force. Bradley had approached from behind, his cologne expensive but overpowering in the humid air. His voice dropped to a tone that was both patronizing and threatening, the same voice he probably used with incompetent subordinates at his investment firm. "Maria, we need to discuss the practical arrangements moving forward," he said, his gray eyes scanning the departing mourners to ensure privacy for their conversation. Mother's death changes the household dynamic significantly, and certain adjustments will need to be made rather quickly. Stephanie materialized at Bradley's other side with the silent efficiency of a practiced legal predator, her green eyes bright with anticipation. From a legal standpoint, she began, her voice taking on the measured cadence she used when explaining complex contracts to confused clients. The property situation is quite clear-cut. Mother never formalized any long-term arrangements regarding the house, which means the estate reverts to her legal heirs according to standard inheritance law. She paused meaningfully, allowing the implications to settle. Without documented legal standing, continued residence becomes a matter of family generosity rather than legal right. Connor approached from the other direction, effectively boxing Maria in between the three siblings in a move that felt rehearsed despite its apparent spontaneity. His usually nervous energy had been replaced by cold focus, his blue eyes holding none of the warmth that Maria remembered from his childhood visits years ago. "The property management team recommends a 2-day transition period," he announced matter-of-factly, pulling his phone from his jacket pocket and consulting it like a business calendar. "That should provide adequate time to gather personal belongings and make alternative living arrangements." Maria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, though whether from grief, shock, or the growing realization of her precarious position, she couldn't determine. For 15 years, she had considered herself part of this family, first as the wife of their father David, and later as Margaret's companion and caregiver. The house on Elm Street had been her home for over a decade, filled with memories of holiday dinners, quiet evenings with Margaret, and the gradual accumulation of a life she had thought was permanent. The idea that her presence there had been nothing more than an informal arrangement subject to immediate termination felt like another death in an already devastating day. Bradley's voice took on the patronizing tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "Of course, we understand this is emotional for you," he said, his words carrying about as much genuine sympathy as a corporate layoff notice. "Mother always appreciated your companionship, particularly during her more difficult periods. However, family obligations require us to handle the estate efficiently and appropriately." He glanced meaningfully at his siblings before continuing. 48 hours should be more than sufficient for gathering your personal effects and transitioning to more suitable accommodations." The casual cruelty of the timeline hit Maria like a physical blow. 48 hours to pack up 15 years of life, to say goodbye to the garden she had tended, the room she had maintained, the bedroom where she had sat countless nights reading to Margaret when sleep wouldn't come. The same bedroom where Margaret had whispered her fears about her children's coldness, their obvious impatience for her death, their complete inability to understand what family actually meant. Maria remembered those late-night conversations now with painful clarity, especially Margaret's frequent references to papers she needed to organize, legal matters that required attention, documents that would ensure Maria's security. Stephanie seemed to interpret Maria's silence as confusion rather than shock, her voice taking on the artificially patient tone she used with particularly slow clients. "I know this seems overwhelming," she said with manufactured concern, "but really, it's quite standard. Informal living arrangements typically conclude with the death of the primary resident, especially when there are legitimate heirs with legal standing." She adjusted her expensive purse strap with practiced efficiency. "We've already spoken with Morrison, Bradley, and Associates about expediting the paperwork, so everything can be handled cleanly and professionally." Connor consulted his phone again, his fingers moving across the screen with the rapid efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple crises simultaneously. "I can recommend several extended-stay facilities that offer reasonable monthly rates," he said without looking up from his device. "Some of them even include basic amenities, though obviously nothing comparable to Mother's house." His tone suggested he was being remarkably generous by offering any assistance at all. Maria found her voice finally, though it came out smaller and more fragile than she had intended. Margaret never mentioned any urgency about living arrangements, she said quietly, her words almost lost in the sound of rain against the cemetery's ancient oak trees. She spoke often about wanting to ensure my security, about papers she was organizing. There might be documents we should review before making such permanent decisions. The three siblings exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words, the sort of practiced family shorthand that excluded outsiders by design. Bradley's laugh held no warmth whatsoever, the sound sharp and dismissive in the humid air. "Maria," he said with exaggerated patience, "Mother's mind wasn't entirely reliable toward the end. The medications, the pain, the confusion that comes with advanced age, these things can create false impressions about legal arrangements that don't actually exist." Stephanie nodded professionally, her legal training evident in the way she dismissed Maria's concerns without appearing overtly cruel. "From a legal perspective," she said with clinical detachment, "verbal assurances and emotional promises have no standing in estate law. If Mother had intended any formal arrangements, they would have been documented through proper legal channels and filed with the appropriate authorities." She smiled with the cold efficiency of someone delivering bad news behind a professional mask. "Since no such documentation exists, we proceed according to standard inheritance statutes." Connor finally looked up from his phone, his blue eyes holding the impatient gleam of someone eager to move past an unpleasant but necessary conversation. "The house needs to be appraised, staged, and listed as quickly as possible," he announced with the matter-of-fact tone he used for quarterly projections. "Every day of delay represents lost market value, especially heading into the fall selling season." He slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket with practiced efficiency. 2 days is actually quite generous, considering the market pressures we're facing. As the rain continued to fall around Margaret's grave, Maria realized she was seeing these people clearly for perhaps the first time. The grief, the stress, and the shock had stripped away the polite pretenses that had characterized their interactions during Margaret's lifetime, revealing the cold calculation that lay beneath their familiar faces. These weren't the children she had tried to include in family dinners, the young adults she had sent birthday cards to, the family members she had hoped might grow to accept her as something more than an outsider. These were strangers who happened to share Margaret's DNA, and their mother's death had apparently freed them to express their true feelings without fear of maternal disapproval. Bradley straightened his expensive tie and checked his Rolex with the casual efficiency of someone concluding a successful business meeting. "I think we've covered all the essential points," he said with finality, his gray eyes already scanning the parking area where his BMW waited. "We'll arrange for someone to change the locks tomorrow evening, so you'll want to complete your packing before then." He paused meaningfully, his voice taking on the threatening undertone that had made him successful in high-pressure negotiations. "Any personal items left behind after the deadline will be considered abandoned property and disposed of accordingly." As the three siblings walked away toward their luxury vehicles, their expensive shoes clicking against the wet pavement, Maria remained standing beside Margaret's grave with the yellow roses still clutched in her trembling hands. The rain had soaked through her simple dress, and the cemetery was empty now except for the groundskeepers waiting respectfully in the distance for her departure. She knelt slowly beside the fresh earth, placing her modest bouquet next to the elaborate arrangements that would be removed and discarded within days. "Margaret," she whispered to the silent grave, her voice breaking on the name she had spoken thousands of times during their years together. "You promised I would never be homeless again. You said you had taken care of everything, that there were papers, arrangements that would protect me." She wiped away tears that had finally come, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I don't understand what happened to those promises, but I remember them clearly, and I have to believe you meant what you said." The drive back to the house on Elm Street felt like a journey to a foreign country, every familiar landmark now transformed by the knowledge that her time in this place was being measured in hours rather than years. The key still worked in the front door, though Bradley's mention of changed locks meant that this simple privilege would expire with ruthless efficiency. Inside, the house felt different already, no longer a home but a temporary shelter that belonged to people who viewed her presence as an unwelcome intrusion on their inheritance planning. Maria climbed the stairs to Margaret's bedroom, the room where she had spent so many nights during the final months, monitoring medications, adjusting pillows, reading aloud from the romance novels that Margaret had loved despite her children's condescending comments about their literary value. The room still smelled like Margaret's lavender lotion and the vanilla candles she had insisted on burning during their evening conversations. It was here that Margaret had spoken most often about the papers she needed to organize, the legal matters that required attention, the documents that would ensure Maria's future security. Tomorrow, she would begin the impossible task of packing up 15 years of life into whatever boxes she could find, sorting through memories and possessions with the efficiency that grief demanded. But tonight, in Margaret's room, she would allow herself to remember the promises that had been made, the assurances that her devotion and sacrifice had been recognized, the mysterious papers that Margaret had referenced so often in those final months. Somewhere in this house, Maria believed, were the answers that would make sense of Margaret's confident assurances about security and protection. The 48-hour countdown had begun, but Maria Elena Rodriguez was not ready to surrender without understanding what had happened to the promises that had sustained her through 8 years of caregiving and 15 years of trying to build a family with people who had never wanted her as anything more than convenient help. Margaret's voice echoed in her memory, persistent and clear despite the months that had passed since their last conversation, reminding her that family meant more than blood, and that true loyalty was always rewarded in the end. The morning after Margaret's funeral dawned gray and merciless, with autumn sunlight filtering weakly through the lace curtains that Maria had hung in the breakfast nook 3 years earlier. She sat at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, staring at the empty cardboard boxes she had retrieved from the basement storage room, each one representing a piece of her life that would need to be sorted, packed, and relocated within the next 36 hours. The familiar weight of the morning routine felt surreal now, knowing that this would be among the last times she would prepare coffee in Margaret's kitchen, watch the sun rise over the garden they had planned together, or sit in the comfortable silence that had defined so many peaceful mornings over the past 8 years. The sound of multiple car doors slamming in the driveway announced the arrival of the Whitmore siblings with military precision, their expensive vehicles arranged like a small convoy of entitlement on the circular drive. Maria watched through the window as Bradley emerged from his black BMW sedan, followed immediately by Stephanie from her silver Mercedes coupe and Connor from his Tesla Model S, each of them dressed in what she had learned to recognize as their professional armor. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of a corporate raiding party, which, she realized with growing dread, was probably an accurate description of their intentions. Bradley entered through the front door without knocking, his key ring jingling with the casual authority of someone who had never questioned his right to access any space he desired. His charcoal business suit was impeccably pressed despite the early hour, and his steel gray eyes immediately began cataloging the contents of the foyer with the calculating precision of an appraiser. "Good morning, Maria," he said with the sort of professional courtesy he might extend to a hotel concierge, his tone conveying both politeness and complete emotional detachment. "We thought it would be helpful to coordinate the transition process, ensure that personal items and family heirlooms are properly categorized during the packing phase." Stephanie followed close behind, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, her navy pinstripe suit and matching briefcase projecting the image of someone prepared for serious business. She carried a leather portfolio thick with documents and a tablet computer, both tools of her legal trade that she wielded with practiced intimidation. From an organizational standpoint, she announced without preamble, her green eyes scanning the living room with clinical detachment, "We need to establish clear categories for items being removed versus items remaining with the property. Some pieces have significant estate value that needs to be preserved for proper distribution among the legal heirs." Connor appeared in the doorway with his usual restless energy, though this morning it seemed focused rather than scattered, his blue eyes bright with the sort of anticipation he typically reserved for successful product launches. His casual blazer and designer jeans struck a calculated balance between approachable and authoritative, the uniform of someone who had learned to project competence across multiple demographic categories. "I've brought some additional boxes and packing materials," he said with manufactured helpfulness, gesturing toward the collection of supplies visible through the open front door. "Professional-grade stuff, much better than whatever you might have scrounged up from the basement." Maria felt the walls of her home closing in around her as the three siblings dispersed throughout the house with practiced efficiency, each claiming territory like generals dividing conquered land. Their movement patterns were clearly coordinated, the result of discussions and planning that had taken place without her knowledge or input, probably during the previous evening while she had been sitting alone in Margaret's bedroom, grieving and trying to process the sudden destruction of everything she had believed about her place in this family. Bradley positioned himself in the formal dining room, his attention immediately drawn to Margaret's collection of Waterford crystal and sterling silver serving pieces that had been wedding gifts from her marriage to their father 30 years earlier. "These pieces have considerable auction value," he observed aloud, his voice carrying easily throughout the house, particularly the complete place settings and the serving pieces. "Mother always said they should stay in the family, passed down to children who would appreciate their significance." He lifted one of the crystal wine glasses to examine it in the morning light, his movements reverent in a way that his treatment of his living mother had never been. Stephanie had claimed the study as her operational base, spreading her legal documents across Margaret's antique writing desk with the territorial confidence of someone conducting a hostile takeover. Her tablet computer displayed what appeared to be inventory spreadsheets and property assessments, evidence of preparation that extended far beyond the previous day's funeral arrangements. "The artwork in this room alone represents a significant asset base," she called out to her brothers, her voice taking on the analytical tone she used when reviewing complex contracts. "The oil paintings, the first edition books, the sculpture collection, these items require professional appraisal before any distribution decisions are finalized." Connor had gravitated toward the entertainment center and electronics, his tech background evident in the way he examined Margaret's sound system, television, and the computer equipment that Maria had helped her mother-in-law learn to use for video calls with distant relatives. "This equipment is mostly obsolete," he announced with the dismissive authority of someone accustomed to rapid technological turnover, "though some of the components might have resale value if we move quickly enough." He unplugged the computer tower with casual efficiency, already treating it as his property to dispose of as he saw fit. Maria found herself following the siblings around her own home like a ghost, watching them evaluate and catalog the possessions that represented 15 years of shared life with Margaret. Every item they touched, every comment they made, every casual assumption about ownership felt like another small violence against the memories she was trying to preserve. The cruelest irony was that many of the items they were claiming as family heirlooms had been gifts from Margaret to Maria over the years, tokens of affection and gratitude that were now being reclassified as estate property by people who couldn't be bothered to visit their mother more than twice a year. The systematic nature of their inventory became clear as the morning progressed, with each sibling maintaining detailed notes about items in their designated areas, while cross-referencing with property assessments that had obviously been commissioned weeks or even months before Margaret's death. The efficiency of their operations suggested planning that predated any terminal diagnosis, a level of preparation that spoke to expectations about their mother's mortality that they had never shared with the woman actually caring for her on a daily basis. Bradley's voice carried particular authority when he addressed the contents of Margaret's jewelry collection, his tone suggesting expertise that Maria knew he didn't actually possess. "The pieces in Mother's bedroom safe will require professional authentication," he declared while examining a sapphire brooch that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother. Several items appeared to be genuine antiques with substantial market value, particularly the Victorian pieces and anything with documented provenance. He held up a pearl necklace that Maria remembered Margaret wearing to their wedding 15 years earlier. These sorts of heirloom pieces need to remain in the biological family, obviously. Stephanie's legal training became evident as she photographed each room from multiple angles, creating what appeared to be a comprehensive visual record of the property's contents before any items were removed. "This documentation serves multiple purposes," she explained with clinical efficiency, both for insurance purposes and to establish baseline inventory for estate distribution. If any disputes arise later about missing or damaged items, we'll have complete photographic evidence of the original condition and placement. Connor's approach was more direct and immediate, his tendency toward instant gratification evident in the way he began removing smaller electronics and technological items without waiting for formal approval from his siblings. Most of this stuff was probably outdated when Mother bought it, he muttered while disconnecting cables and gathering remote controls. But the newer pieces might be worth something if we can move them through the right channels quickly enough. As the siblings worked through the house with increasing confidence, their conversations began to include casual cruelties that seemed designed to remind Maria of her outsider status in what had been her home for over a decade. Their comments were crafted with the sort of plausible deniability that allowed them to claim innocent intent while delivering maximum emotional damage, a technique that suggested considerable practice in the art of psychological warfare. Bradley's observations about the living room furniture carried particular sting because they dismissed not only Maria's taste, but her entire contribution to making the house comfortable during Margaret's final years. Some of these pieces will need to be replaced before listing the property, he said while examining the recliner where Margaret had spent her last months, his tone suggesting that comfort and accessibility were character flaws rather than medical necessities. The health-related modifications detract significantly from the room's aesthetic appeal to potential buyers. Stephanie's comments about the kitchen revealed a complete disconnect from the practical realities of caring for an elderly person with limited mobility and specific dietary requirements. The equipment modifications were obviously necessary for Mother's condition, she observed with clinical detachment while examining the lowered shelving and easy grip handles that Maria had installed to help Margaret maintain some independence. However, most buyers will expect a more conventional layout, so restoration to original specifications will be essential before marketing. Connor's focus on the garden and outdoor spaces demonstrated his complete ignorance of the therapeutic value that Margaret had derived from watching Maria tend the flowers and vegetables they had planted together over 8 years of shared seasons. The landscaping is pretty labor-intensive, he noted while photographing the raised beds and accessible pathways that had allowed Margaret to continue enjoying her yard even after walking became difficult. Most buyers in this price range prefer low-maintenance outdoor spaces, so will probably want to simplify the whole setup significantly. The casual erasure of Maria's contributions to Margaret's comfort and happiness felt more devastating than direct insults would have been, because it revealed the depth of their inability to see her as anything more than hired help whose personal investment in their mother's well-being was irrelevant to their inheritance calculations. They moved through the house like efficiency experts evaluating a business acquisition, noting problems to be corrected and assets to be maximized without any recognition that they were dismantling a home where love and loyalty had flourished despite their neglect. As the inventory process continued into the afternoon, Maria retreated to Margaret's bedroom, the one space that still felt sacred despite the invasion taking place throughout the rest of the house. The room retained Margaret's presence in ways that the siblings couldn't catalog or claim, filled with memories of late-night conversations, shared laughter over romance novels, and quiet moments of companionship that had sustained both women through the challenges of aging and illness. It was in this room that Margaret had spoken most often about the papers she was organizing, the legal arrangements she was making to ensure Maria's security, the mysterious meetings with lawyers that had taken place during the months when her health was declining, but her mind remained sharp and focused. Maria remembered those conversations clearly now, especially Margaret's repeated assurances that loyalty and love would be protected, that family meant more than blood relationships, and that the future was more secure than appearances might suggest. The memory of Margaret's nightstand drawer sent Maria searching through the small collection of personal items that the siblings hadn't yet claimed for the estate. Hidden beneath Margaret's reading glasses and prescription bottles, she found a small folded piece of paper in Margaret's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script that had filled countless grocery lists and birthday cards over the years they had shared. The note was brief but specific, written in the trembling but determined hand of someone who wanted to be certain her message would be understood. Maria, darling, The papers are safe with people who understand what family really means. You will never be homeless again, never helpless again, never without protection again. The children cannot see beyond their own expectations, but love finds a way to prevail. Trust the process, trust the timing, and remember that the best surprises come when hope seems lost. The note was dated just 6 weeks before Margaret's death, during the period when her physical condition had been deteriorating, but her mental clarity had remained intact. Maria remembered that particular evening clearly because it had been one of Margaret's better days, when pain medication wasn't clouding her thinking and her old personality had shone through the fog of illness with startling brightness. They had discussed the garden plans for the following spring, the books Margaret wanted to finish reading, and the legal matters she was handling with increased urgency as her condition worsened. Maria folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket, feeling like she was carrying a piece of Margaret's love and protection with her as she faced the remaining hours of her deadline. The mysterious references to papers and legal arrangements felt more substantial now, less like the confused ramblings of an elderly woman and more like the careful planning of someone who understood exactly what challenges her death would create for the person who had been her truest companion. The sound of the siblings' voices carried up from the first floor, their tone becoming more celebratory as the day progressed, and their inventory revealed the full extent of their inheritance. Their casual cruelty was becoming more open as well, no longer tempered by any pretense of concern for Maria's feelings or appreciation for her years of service to their mother. They spoke about her as if she had already departed, discussing the house's potential and their plans for its contents as if her presence was merely a temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself automatically. As evening approached and Maria's 48-hour deadline shortened to mere hours, she found herself standing in Margaret's bedroom with empty boxes around her, trying to determine which pieces of their shared life she could realistically pack and transport to whatever uncertain future awaited her. The task felt impossible not because of its scope, but because of its cruelty, the forced separation from a place that had been home in all the ways that mattered most. Margaret's voice echoed in her memory with increasing clarity, reminding her of promises made and assurances given during those final months when both women had known that time was running out. The papers Margaret had referenced so often, the legal arrangements she had made with such secretive determination, the lawyers she had consulted during visits that the siblings had dismissed as routine medical appointments, all of these mysterious elements began to form a pattern that suggested Margaret's planning had been far more comprehensive than anyone realized. Tomorrow morning would bring the changing of the locks and the end of Maria's time in the house on Elm Street. But tonight she would pack with the quiet dignity that Margaret had always admired, trusting in promises that transcended the cruelty of children who had never learned to value the family they had been given. The note in her pocket felt like a talisman against despair, a reminder that love and loyalty had power that extended beyond the reach of selfishness and greed. The offices of Chun and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a modest brick building downtown, far from the gleaming corporate towers where firms like Morrison, Bradley and Associates conducted their high-stakes legal warfare. Maria sat in the small waiting area with Margaret's folded note clutched in her trembling hands, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake by pursuing what might turn out to be nothing more than the confused hope of a grieving woman. The legal aid hotline had given her David Chen's name when she explained her situation, describing him as an estate attorney who specialized in elder care issues and family disputes, though they had warned her that his services might be beyond her limited financial means. The receptionist, a kindly woman in her 60s with silver hair and gentle eyes, had assured Maria that Mr. Chun would see her despite the lack of an appointment, explaining that he made time for emergency consultations when people faced immediate housing crises. The waiting room itself was comfortable but unpretentious, filled with well-worn furniture and family photographs that suggested a practice focused on real people rather than corporate clients. Maria found herself studying a wall display of thank you letters from grateful clients, their handwritten words describing successful resolutions to problems that had seemed hopeless, outcomes that had preserved families and protected vulnerable people from those who would exploit their circumstances. When David Chun emerged from his office to greet her, Maria was struck immediately by his warm demeanor and genuine concern, qualities that seemed almost foreign after her recent interactions with the Whitmore siblings and their casual cruelty. At approximately 50 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built his reputation through decades of careful work rather than aggressive self-promotion. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his brown eyes held the sort of compassionate intelligence that made people feel heard rather than judged, a quality that Maria suspected had served him well in his chosen specialty of protecting the elderly and vulnerable. Mr. Chun extended his hand with a warmth that immediately put Maria at ease, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had immigrated to this country as a child but retained the careful precision of someone who never took language for granted. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said with genuine concern evident in his tone, "please come in and tell me about your situation. The receptionist mentioned that you're facing an immediate housing crisis related to an estate matter, and I want to understand exactly what's happening so we can determine the best way to help." His office reflected the same unpretentious professionalism as the waiting room, with law books lining the walls and a large desk covered with case files and family photographs that spoke to a practice built on long-term relationships rather than quick transactions. Maria settled into a comfortable chair across from his desk, feeling for the first time in days like she was in the presence of someone who might actually listen to her concerns without dismissing them as the delusions of a displaced housekeeper. As Maria began to explain her situation, starting with Margaret's death and the stepchildren's immediate demand that she vacate the house within 48 hours, she watched David Chin's expression shift from professional concern to growing surprise, and then to something that looked remarkably like recognition. When she mentioned Margaret's full name and the address of the house on Elm Street, his eyebrows rose in unmistakable surprise, and he leaned forward in his chair with sudden intense interest. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he interrupted gently, his voice taking on a tone of amazement mixed with professional excitement. "Are you the Maria that Margaret Whitmore spoke about so frequently during our consultations?" His question was delivered with such certainty that it sounded more like a statement of recognition than a request for information. "She talked about you constantly, described you as the daughter she should have had, the family member who actually understood what love and loyalty meant." The shock of hearing her relationship with Margaret validated by a complete stranger hit Maria like a physical blow, bringing tears to her eyes for the first time since the funeral. For 3 days, she had endured the stepchildren's dismissal of her bond with their mother, their casual erasure of 8 years of devoted care, their treatment of her as nothing more than hired help who had gotten ideas above her station. To have a professional stranger acknowledge the depth of that relationship felt like receiving confirmation that she hadn't imagined the love and mutual respect that had sustained both women through Margaret's final years. Mr. Chin reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a thick manila folder with Margaret's name clearly visible on the tab, his movements suggesting familiarity with its contents that spoke to extensive consultation and careful preparation. "Margaret was one of my most determined clients," he said with a mixture of admiration and sadness, "a woman who understood exactly what needed to be accomplished and was willing to take whatever steps were necessary to protect the person who had shown her such devoted care. She came to me initially about 18 months before her death, specifically seeking legal mechanisms to ensure your security and protection." As he opened the folder and began spreading documents across his desk, Maria felt her heart racing with a combination of hope and disbelief that made it difficult to breathe steadily. The papers appeared to be official legal documents, complete with official seals and signatures, the sort of formal paperwork that the stepchildren had insisted didn't exist. Margaret's handwriting was visible on several pages, her distinctive script filling out forms and signing authorizations with the careful precision of someone who understood the permanent significance of her actions. "The most remarkable thing about Margaret's approach," Mr. Chun continued while organizing the documents for Maria's review, "was her absolute insistence on secrecy during the legal process. She was convinced that her biological children would attempt to interfere with her plans if they discovered what she was doing. So every consultation, every filing, every step of the process was conducted with complete confidentiality. She even used her maiden name for some of the paperwork to avoid any possibility of accidental discovery by family members who might have connections in the legal community. Maria stared at the documents spread across the desk, trying to process the implications of what she was seeing while struggling to understand how such extensive legal work could have been completed without her knowledge or awareness. Margaret had always been protective of Maria's feelings, careful not to burden her with worries about the future or concerns about what would happen after her death. But the scope of these preparations suggested planning that extended far beyond simple will modifications or trust fund arrangements. Mr. Chun lifted one particular document with the reverent care of someone handling something precious, his expression mixing professional pride with personal satisfaction. This, Mrs. Rodriguez, is the legal adoption decree that makes you Margaret Whitmore's daughter in the eyes of the law, completed and filed 22 months before her death when her health was declining, but her mental capacity was completely intact. The process took nearly 8 months to complete because of Margaret's insistence on absolute secrecy, but every requirement was fulfilled, every procedure followed to the letter. The words legal adoption hit Maria's consciousness like a lightning strike, sending shock waves through her understanding of everything that had transpired since Margaret's death. She stared at the official document with its embossed seal and formal signatures, trying to comprehend how something so significant could have been accomplished without her awareness or understanding. The implications were staggering, transforming her legal status from that of a displaced housekeeper to that of a legitimate heir with rights equal to those of the biological children who had been treating her with such casual cruelty. Margaret was extremely concerned about your vulnerability, Mr. Chun explained while pointing to specific sections of the adoption paperwork, particularly your lack of family support and financial resources in case something happened to her. She felt that her biological children had demonstrated repeatedly that they couldn't be trusted to honor informal arrangements or respect emotional bonds, so she wanted to create legal protections that would be absolutely unassailable in court. As the reality of her new legal status began to sink in, Maria found herself remembering dozens of conversations with Margaret that suddenly made perfect sense in this new context. The mysterious legal appointments that Margaret had dismissed as routine paperwork, the late-night phone calls with lawyers that had seemed unusually secretive, the repeated assurances about security and protection that had felt like emotional comfort rather than practical promises. All of these elements now revealed themselves as components of an elaborate legal strategy designed to outmaneuver the very people who were currently celebrating their anticipated inheritance. The adoption process itself had been surprisingly complex, Mr. Chun continued while showing Maria the various stages of documentation, because adult adoption requires different procedures than child adoption, particularly when the adoptee is unaware of the proceedings. We had to demonstrate clear evidence of an existing family relationship, document Margaret's mental competency throughout the process, and establish that the adoption served legitimate purposes related to estate planning and family continuity rather than any attempt to defraud other heirs. Maria studied the photographs that had been submitted as evidence of their family relationship, images of holiday celebrations, birthday parties, and quiet domestic moments that Margaret had apparently been collecting systematically as documentation of their bond. The pictures told the story of 8 years of shared life, from early awkward attempts at blending families to the comfortable companionship of their final years together. Seeing their relationship presented as legal evidence felt surreal, but it also validated everything she had felt about their connection during those years when the stepchildren's indifference had made her question her place in the family. The most brilliant aspect of Margaret's strategy, Mr. Chin said with obvious admiration for his former client's planning, was her decision to keep the adoption secret until after her death. She understood that advanced knowledge would prompt her biological children to challenge the proceedings, possibly creating legal obstacles that could have delayed or prevented the adoption from being finalized. By waiting until the adoption was complete and irreversible before revealing its existence, she ensured that your legal rights would be established beyond any possibility of interference. While Maria struggled to absorb the life-changing information that David Chun was presenting with such careful documentation, the Whitmore siblings were conducting their own celebration at Chez Laurent, the most expensive restaurant in the city. their voices carrying easily across the intimate dining room as they toasted their mother's death and their anticipated inheritance with glasses of champagne that cost more than Maria's monthly grocery budget. Bradley had chosen the restaurant specifically for its exclusivity and the privacy it afforded for sensitive business discussions, though his definition of sensitivity had more to do with gloating about their good fortune than protecting anyone's feelings. The private dining room he had reserved was decorated with understated elegance that appealed to his sense of superiority, complete with crystal stemware and sterling silver place settings that reminded him of the lifestyle he felt entitled to maintain and expand with his mother's money. Stephanie arrived at the restaurant directly from a successful day at her law firm, her confidence buoyed by the praise she had received from senior partners for her handling of a complex estate dispute that had resulted in a favorable settlement for their corporate client. Her navy business suit and expensive jewelry projected the image of someone accustomed to winning, and her green eyes sparkled with anticipation as she reviewed the mental calculations she had been making about her share of Margaret's estate. Connor appeared at their table with the restless energy of someone who had spent the afternoon researching luxury real estate and high-end investment opportunities, his tablet computer loaded with property listings and financial projections that reflected his confidence in their imminent wealth. His casual designer clothing and expensive accessories suggested someone who had never questioned his ability to afford whatever lifestyle appealed to him, and his blue eyes held the gleam of someone already planning his next upgrade. The siblings' conversation over appetizers revealed the depth of their callous assumptions about their inheritance rights and their complete dismissal of any possibility that their plans might encounter legal obstacles. Bradley's discussion of his intentions to liquidate Margaret's assets as quickly as possible demonstrated his view of their mother's possessions as commodities to be converted into cash rather than memories to be preserved or honored. Stephanie's legal expertise provided what appeared to be authoritative confirmation of their rights. Her analysis of inheritance law delivered with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation where her professional knowledge proved inadequate to the circumstances. Her colleagues at Morrison, Bradley & Associates had reviewed the basic facts of the case and confirmed her assessment that informal arrangements with household help had no legal standing whatsoever, making their inheritance process a simple matter of proper paperwork and efficient asset distribution. Connor's focus on the real estate market reflected his impatience to convert their inheritance into liquid assets that could be immediately invested in his various technology ventures and luxury purchases. His research into comparable property values had convinced him that their mother's house could be sold quickly for a substantial profit, particularly if they were willing to price it competitively and avoid the delays that typically accompanied estate sales. The irony of their celebration, taking place simultaneously with Maria's discovery of her legal status as their adoptive sister and equal heir, would have been amusing if it weren't so perfectly characteristic of their fundamental inability to consider possibilities that challenged their assumptions about their own superiority. Their expensive champagne and elaborate meal represented the sort of premature victory celebration that Margaret had anticipated when she designed her legal strategy to protect Maria from exactly this kind of arrogant presumption. As the evening progressed, and their conversation became more detailed about their specific plans for disposing of Margaret's assets, the siblings revealed the extent to which they had been planning for their mother's death long before her actual passing. Their familiarity with property values, auction houses, and estate sale procedures suggested preparation that extended far beyond the normal considerations that grieving children might have about settling their parents' affairs. Bradley's contacts in the investment world had already provided preliminary assessments of Margaret's stock portfolio and retirement accounts, information that he had apparently been gathering for months before her death as her health declined. His plans for redirecting those investments into his own financial strategies demonstrated a level of detailed preparation that bordered on the ghoulish, particularly given his absence from most of the actual caregiving that had occupied Margaret's final years. Stephanie's legal connections had furnished her with extensive knowledge about probate procedures and inheritance timelines, allowing her to create detailed schedules for asset distribution that would minimize tax implications while maximizing their individual shares of the estate. Her confidence in her ability to handle all legal aspects of the inheritance process reflected both her professional expertise and her complete ignorance of the surprise that awaited her when the adoption papers were filed with the probate court. Connor's technology background had enabled him to research digital asset recovery, ensuring that any online accounts, cryptocurrency holdings, or electronic financial instruments would be identified and claimed as part of their inheritance. His systematic approach to asset identification revealed a thoroughness that might have been admirable if it weren't being applied to the premature dismantling of their mother's life, while the woman who had actually cared for her was sleeping in a motel room, convinced that she had no legal recourse against their cruelty. Meanwhile, back in David Chen's office, the final pieces of Margaret's legal strategy were being revealed to Maria with methodical precision, each document representing another layer of protection that her adoptive mother had constructed against the very scenarios that were currently unfolding. The scope of Margaret's planning extended far beyond the adoption itself, encompassing detailed instructions for the revelation process, protective measures against potential challenges, and even financial arrangements designed to ensure Maria's security during any legal proceedings that might arise. Margaret understood that her biological children would likely contest the adoption once they discovered its existence. Mr. Chen explained while showing Maria the extensive evidence file that had been prepared to support their case. She spent months gathering documentation of their neglect, recording instances of their disrespectful behavior, and creating a comprehensive record of your devotion and care that would demonstrate to any court why the adoption served legitimate family purposes rather than representing any attempt to defraud her natural heirs. The evidence file was remarkable in its thoroughness, containing everything from medical records documenting Maria's involvement in Margaret's care to photographs of family gatherings where the biological children's absence was conspicuous. From copies of birthday cards and holiday gifts that demonstrated ongoing emotional bonds to financial records showing Maria's personal contributions to household expenses and Margaret's comfort. The cumulative effect was a portrait of a family relationship that had been built through daily devotion rather than genetic accident. Mr. Chen's final revelation involved the timing strategy that Margaret had devised for maximizing the impact of the adoption disclosure while minimizing the opportunity for interference from her biological children. The legal papers would be filed with the probate court the following morning, immediately establishing Maria's rights as an equal heir while simultaneously notifying the other parties that their assumptions about inheritance distribution had been fundamentally incorrect. "Tomorrow morning, Mrs. Rodriguez," he said with the satisfaction of someone about to deliver long-awaited justice, "you'll discover that you're not homeless or powerless at all. You're Margaret Whitmore's legal daughter, with inheritance rights identical to those of her biological children, and no amount of wealth or legal expertise on their part can change what your mother accomplished to protect you." As Maria prepared to leave the office with copies of her adoption papers and a detailed explanation of the legal proceedings that would begin the next day, she felt Margaret's presence more strongly than she had since the funeral. The mysterious promises, the cryptic references to protection and security, the confident assurances that love would prevail over cruelty, all of these elements now revealed themselves as the carefully planned strategy of a woman who understood her children's character perfectly and had taken steps to ensure that loyalty and devotion would be rewarded rather than exploited. The 48-hour deadline that had seemed like an impossible ultimatum was about to become the timeline for the most satisfying legal reversal that David Chen had ever had the privilege to orchestrate, and Margaret Whitmore's final gift to the daughter who had earned that title through love rather than biology was about to transform 3 arrogant heirs into 3 very surprised defendants in a probate case they never saw coming. The morning after Maria's revelation at David Chen's office dawned with the crisp clarity that often accompanies life-changing moments, the kind of autumn day when possibilities seem endless and justice feels within reach. While Maria sat in her modest motel room reviewing the adoption papers that had transformed her understanding of her own identity overnight, the Whitmore siblings were conducting business as usual, their confidence in their legal superiority so absolute that they couldn't conceive of any scenario where their inheritance plans might encounter meaningful opposition. Bradley arrived at Morrison, Bradley and Associates precisely at 9 o'clock, his black BMW taking its customary place in the executive parking garage beneath the gleaming 30-story tower that housed one of the city's most prestigious law firms. His charcoal Armani suit was perfectly pressed, his Italian leather shoes polished to mirror brightness, and his steel gray eyes held the satisfied gleam of someone about to conclude a simple business transaction that would significantly enhance his already comfortable lifestyle. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor provided him with a moment to review his talking points for what he anticipated would be a brief consultation about expediting Maria's removal from the family property. The law offices of Morrison, Bradley and Associates occupied an entire floor of the downtown tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows providing panoramic views of the city that served both practical and psychological purposes. Clients were meant to feel impressed by the obvious success and power of the firm, while the lawyers themselves were reminded daily of their elevated status above the common struggles of ordinary people. The reception area was decorated with original artwork and handcrafted furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries, creating an atmosphere of refined intimidation that had served the firm well in high-stakes negotiations. James Morrison himself was available for the consultation, a testament to both the firm's respect for Bradley's family wealth and their confidence that this particular case represented nothing more than a routine matter of removing an unwelcome household employee from valuable real estate. At 62 years old, Morrison had built his reputation on estate disputes involving wealthy families, and his silver hair, expensive suits, and commanding presence had intimidated countless opponents into accepting settlements far below what they might have achieved with more persistent legal representation. Morrison's corner office reflected his status as senior partner, with mahogany furniture, leather-bound law books, and a collection of awards and photographs that documented 3 decades of successful legal warfare on behalf of the city's most privileged families. His desk was positioned to take advantage of the spectacular city views while forcing visitors to sit with their backs to the distracting scenery, a subtle psychological advantage that he had learned to exploit in countless negotiations. Bradley settled into one of the client chairs with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his ability to purchase whatever legal services his problems required, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to having his concerns treated as priorities by expensive professionals. "The situation is quite straightforward," he began without preamble, his gray eyes focused on Morrison with the intensity of someone discussing a business acquisition. "Our mother passed away 4 days ago, and we need to expedite the removal of a live-in caregiver who seems to have developed unrealistic expectations about her long-term housing arrangements." Morrison leaned back in his executive chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had handled hundreds of similar cases, his manicured fingers steepled in front of him as he listened to Bradley's explanation with the sort of professional attention that cost $500 per hour. "These situations are unfortunately quite common," he observed with the clinical detachment that had made him successful in family law disputes. "Household employees often develop emotional attachments to their work environments that can complicate estate administration if not handled efficiently and decisively." Stephanie had arrived at the law firm directly from her own office at a competing legal practice, her navy pinstripe suit and matching briefcase projecting the image of someone who understood the legal system well enough to navigate it effectively on behalf of her family's interests. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, and her green eyes held the calculating gleam of someone who viewed this consultation as an opportunity to demonstrate her own legal expertise while ensuring that their mother's estate was handled with maximum efficiency. "As a practicing attorney myself," Stephanie interjected with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms, "I've reviewed the basic legal principles governing this situation, and I'm confident that we're dealing with a simple trespassing matter that can be resolved quickly once the appropriate documentation is filed with the court." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had successfully handled complex legal matters for corporate clients, though her experience with estate law was considerably more limited than she was willing to admit. Connor had positioned himself near the windows, his restless energy channeled into reviewing property listings on his tablet computer while his siblings handled the legal consultation that would clear the way for their real estate transaction. His casual blazer and designer jeans represented his attempt to project approachable competence across multiple business contexts, though his blue eyes remained focused on the financial projections he had been calculating since Margaret's funeral. "The sooner we can resolve this issue," he said without looking up from his tablet, "the sooner we can move forward with property preparation and marketing strategies." Morrison's assessment of their case was delivered with the sort of professional confidence that had convinced countless clients to pay substantial legal fees for what amounted to routine paperwork and intimidation tactics. From a legal standpoint, he announced with authority, "Informal arrangements with household staff have absolutely no standing in inheritance law, regardless of the emotional investment that such employees might claim to have developed in their work environment. The law is quite clear about the distinction between legitimate heirs and individuals who happen to have resided in the deceased's property for practical purposes." The consultation proceeded exactly as Bradley had anticipated, with Morrison's firm agreeing to file immediate eviction proceedings that would formalize Maria's removal from the property while protecting the siblings from any potential claims of improper disposal of a tenant. The legal fees would be substantial but manageable given their anticipated inheritance, and Morrison's reputation for successful estate disputes provided them with confidence that their case would be resolved swiftly and decisively. Morrison's secretary was instructed to prepare the necessary documentation for filing with the housing court, a process that he estimated would take no more than 72 hours to complete given the obvious nature of the case and the lack of any legitimate legal standing on Maria's part. The firm's standard retainer for estate disputes was $50,000, a sum that Bradley authorized without hesitation, writing the check with the casual efficiency of someone purchasing luxury goods rather than legal services. As the siblings departed from Morrison's office with signed legal representation agreements and detailed timelines for Maria's formal eviction, their conversation revealed the depth of their confidence in their legal superiority and their complete inability to conceive of any scenario where their plans might encounter meaningful resistance. Their discussion of celebration dinner arrangements and property sale timelines demonstrated their assumption that Maria's removal was merely a formality that would be completed within days. Meanwhile, across the city in David Chin's modest but efficient law office, an entirely different kind of legal preparation was taking place with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly what evidence would be required to support their unprecedented case. Chin had spent the early morning hours reviewing every document in Margaret's extensive file, cross-referencing witness statements with photographic evidence, and ensuring that their presentation would be absolutely unassailable when the adoption papers were filed with the probate court. The evidence that Margaret had systematically collected during the 18 months preceding her death was remarkable in its thoroughness and strategic value, representing the careful planning of someone who understood her children's character perfectly and had taken steps to document their neglect while simultaneously creating an unbreakable record of Maria's devotion and sacrifice. Each piece of documentation told part of a larger story that would be devastating to the siblings' claims of superior family bonds and legitimate inheritance rights. Margaret's detailed journals provided day-by-day accounts of her final years that painted a clear picture of which family members had actually been present during her decline and which had been conspicuously absent from the daily realities of elder care. Her handwriting was careful and methodical, documenting not only Maria's consistent presence and care, but also the siblings' repeated failures to visit, call, or contribute to their mother's comfort and well-being. The medical records that Margaret had specifically requested from her physicians provided objective documentation of Maria's involvement in every aspect of her care, from transportation to appointments to medication management to physical therapy assistance. The contrast with her biological children's minimal involvement in her health care was stark and undeniable, creating a legal record that would be difficult for any court to ignore when evaluating the legitimacy of the adoption and the motivations behind Margaret's decision. Chin had also contacted the witnesses who had been present during the adoption proceedings, ensuring that their availability for testimony was confirmed and their recollections of Margaret's mental state and decision-making process were clearly documented. The adoption judge, the court clerk, and the social worker who had evaluated the case were all prepared to testify about Margaret's competency and her genuine desire to formalize her relationship with Maria through legal channels. The most powerful evidence in their collection consisted of the audio recordings that Margaret had made during the final months of her life, capturing conversations with her biological children that demonstrated their callous attitudes toward her welfare and their obvious impatience for her death. Margaret had been systematic about documenting these interactions, using a small digital recorder that Maria had helped her learn to operate for what they had claimed was voice diary therapy recommended by her counselor. The recordings revealed the siblings' true personalities with devastating clarity, capturing their dismissive comments about Margaret's health concerns, their impatient responses to her requests for emotional support, and their calculating discussions about inheritance matters that they thought were private conversations. The contrast between these recorded interactions and their public expressions of grief and loss would be particularly damaging to any claims they might make about their close family relationships. Chen's strategy for revealing the adoption involved careful timing that would maximize the legal and psychological impact while minimizing the siblings' opportunities to mount effective countermeasures. The probate filing would be submitted late in the afternoon on a Friday, ensuring that the siblings and their expensive legal team would have an entire weekend to contemplate their changed circumstances before any formal proceedings could begin. The local media attention that Bradley's social media campaign had generated would work in their favor, as the story of wealthy siblings evicting their mother's devoted caregiver had already attracted public sympathy for Maria's situation. When the adoption revelation transformed her from victim to equal heir, the narrative shift would be particularly satisfying for audiences who had been following the developing drama through local news coverage and social media discussions. Bradley's decision to document Maria's eviction on social media had been motivated by his desire to publicly humiliate someone he viewed as a social inferior who had presumed to claim equality with her betters. His posts had included photographs of Maria's modest possessions being packed into boxes, cruel captions about people who forgot their place in the natural order, and mocking commentary about the difference between family and hired help that had resonated with his similarly privileged social circle. The viral nature of Bradley's social media campaign had exceeded even his expectations, with his posts being shared thousands of times by people who either admired his direct approach to dealing with presumptuous employees or were outraged by his obvious cruelty toward a grieving woman. The attention had attracted local news outlets, who had contacted Bradley for interviews about the family's approach to estate management and their perspective on appropriate boundaries between employers and household staff. Stephanie had contributed to the social media narrative by posting her own legal analysis of inheritance law, explaining to her professional network how cases involving confused household employees were typically resolved through efficient legal action rather than extended sympathy or misplaced emotional consideration. Her posts had been shared widely within the local legal community, where her confident assertions about the obvious nature of their case had generated admiration for her analytical skills and practical approach to family law. Connor's contributions to their social media campaign had focused on the business aspects of estate management, with posts about property values, market timing, and investment strategies that demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of wealth preservation and growth. His followers had been impressed by his detailed knowledge of real estate markets and his strategic approach to converting inherited assets into liquid capital for immediate business opportunities. The collective effect of their social media presence had been to create a detailed public record of their attitudes toward Maria and their assumptions about their legal superiority, evidence that would be particularly valuable when their adoption surprise was revealed and their true character was exposed to the same audiences who had initially admired their business acumen and legal expertise. Chen spent considerable time that afternoon preparing Maria for the emotional and psychological challenges that would accompany the revelation of her legal status and the beginning of formal probate proceedings. The adoption papers would transform her from a displaced caregiver into an equal heir overnight, but the transition would also involve intense scrutiny from hostile family members, aggressive legal opposition, and media attention that might be overwhelming for someone unaccustomed to public conflict. Margaret's financial arrangements for supporting Maria during the legal proceedings were both generous and strategically planned, ensuring that she would have access to high-quality legal representation and living accommodations regardless of how long the probate process might take. The trust fund that Margaret had established specifically for this purpose contained sufficient resources to match or exceed whatever legal firepower the siblings might purchase from their expensive law firm. The most satisfying aspect of Margaret's planning was her anticipation of her children's specific reactions to the adoption revelation, with detailed contingency plans for each type of legal challenge they might attempt to mount against the validity of the proceedings. Her knowledge of their personalities and professional capabilities had enabled her to predict their strategies with remarkable accuracy, allowing Chen to prepare comprehensive responses to arguments that hadn't even been made yet. As Friday afternoon approached and Chen prepared to file the adoption papers with the probate court, Maria found herself thinking about Margaret's final weeks and the conversations they had shared about family, loyalty, and the different ways that love could be expressed and protected. The legal documents that were about to transform 3 confident heirs into 3 very surprised defendants represented more than just clever legal strategy. They represented Margaret's final gift to the daughter who had earned that title through daily devotion rather than genetic accident. The weekend that followed the probate filing would give the Whitmore siblings their last opportunity to enjoy the certainty of their inheritance plans before discovering that their mother's final surprise would require them to choose between acknowledging Maria as their legal sister or engaging in a public legal battle that would expose their true character to the same audiences who had been following their social media campaign with growing interest. Monday morning would bring revelations that would change everything they thought they knew about their family, their inheritance, and their own moral standing in a community that was about to witness one of the most satisfying legal reversals in recent memory. Margaret Whitmore's final lesson to her biological children about the difference between family and blood was about to begin, and Maria Elena Rodriguez was about to discover that love and loyalty had power that transcended every assumption that wealth and privilege had taught her opponents to take for granted. The probate courtroom of Judge Elizabeth Hartford was filled beyond capacity on Monday morning, with local reporters, curious onlookers, and members of the legal community drawn by the social media drama that had captured public attention over the weekend. Bradley's viral posts about evicting his mother's caregiver had generated enough controversy to attract 3 news crews and a standing room-only audience eager to witness what promised to be either a swift victory for inherited privilege or an unexpected reversal of fortune for the underdog. Judge Hartford herself was a formidable woman in her late 50s, with steel-gray hair and penetrating brown eyes that had observed countless family disputes during her 20-year career on the probate bench. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for legal arrogance and her particular sensitivity to cases involving elder abuse or exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The black robes of her office carried authority that even expensive legal representation couldn't intimidate, and her courtroom demeanor suggested someone who had seen enough family cruelty to recognize it immediately. James Morrison entered the courtroom with the confident stride of someone who had never lost a case this straightforward, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his $1,000 suit projecting the sort of expensive competence that intimidated most opposing counsel into quick settlements. Behind him, the Whitmore siblings arranged themselves in the front row with the satisfied expressions of people attending a formality rather than a genuine legal proceeding, their designer clothing and obvious wealth creating a stark contrast with Maria's modest appearance at the defendant's table. Bradley had chosen his most expensive charcoal suit for what he anticipated would be his moment of public vindication, his steel-gray eyes scanning the packed courtroom with the satisfaction of someone about to demonstrate his superiority to an audience of witnesses. Stephanie sat beside him in navy blue silk that cost more than Maria's monthly Social Security check, her auburn hair styled to perfection and her green eyes bright with anticipation of professional validation. Connor fidgeted in his designer blazer, his attention divided between the proceedings and the stock market updates on his phone. David Chen appeared almost understated by comparison, his modest brown suit and simple briefcase creating the impression of someone who relied on preparation rather than intimidation to achieve his legal objectives. Beside him, Maria sat quietly in her best dress, a simple black garment that she had worn to Margaret's funeral, her hands folded in her lap and her expression calm despite the chaos surrounding them. The contrast between her dignity and the siblings' obvious arrogance was not lost on the courtroom observers. Morrison's opening statement was delivered with the theatrical confidence of someone accustomed to overwhelming opposition through sheer legal firepower, his voice carrying easily throughout the packed courtroom as he outlined what he characterized as a simple trespassing case involving a confused household employee who had developed unrealistic expectations about her housing arrangements. The deceased's biological children, he announced with authority, are seeking immediate resolution of this unfortunate situation so they can proceed with proper estate administration. His dismissal of Maria's claims was particularly condescending, delivered with the sort of patronizing sympathy that suggested she was more to be pitied than opposed. Mrs. Rodriguez undoubtedly formed emotional attachments to her work environment during her years of employment, Morrison continued, his tone suggesting he was explaining obvious facts to slow children. However, emotional investment cannot create legal rights where none exist, and informal arrangements with household staff have no standing whatsoever in inheritance law. The siblings nodded approvingly at Morrison's presentation, their expressions suggesting complete confidence in their legal position and their obvious pleasure at having their superiority confirmed by expensive professional representation. Bradley's slight smile indicated his satisfaction with the public humiliation that Maria was receiving, while Stephanie's approving nods demonstrated her professional appreciation for Morrison's legal analysis. Judge Hartford's request for documentation of Maria's legal standing was delivered with the neutral tone that characterized her approach to all probate proceedings, though her sharp eyes seemed to notice the confidence radiating from David Chen's table in contrast to the dismissive arrogance emanating from the plaintiff's section. "Mr. Chen," she said simply, "please provide the court with any documentation supporting your client's claim to inheritance rights in this estate." Chen rose from his seat with calm deliberation, his movements suggesting someone who had been preparing for this exact moment with meticulous care and absolute confidence in his evidence. "Your Honor," he said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the suddenly silent courtroom, "I present to the court the legal adoption decree filed 22 months ago, making Mrs. Maria Elena Rodriguez the legal daughter of the deceased Margaret Whitmore and establishing her inheritance rights as equal to those of the biological children." The adoption papers, bearing official court seals and judicial signatures, seemed to transform the atmosphere of the courtroom instantly from routine proceeding to extraordinary revelation. Chen approached the bench with documents that appeared to glow with official authority, each page representing another nail in the coffin of the siblings' assumptions about their legal superiority and inheritance rights. The impact of his words hit the Whitmore siblings like a physical blow, their confident expressions crumbling into shock, disbelief, and growing horror as the implications of what they were hearing began to penetrate their consciousness. Stephanie's face drained of color so rapidly that her expensive makeup appeared garish against her suddenly pale skin, while Bradley's mouth opened and closed soundlessly like someone trying to speak underwater. Connor's reaction was the most dramatic, his restless energy transforming into obvious panic as he stared at the adoption documents with the expression of someone watching his financial future evaporate in real time. His blue eyes widened with shock, and his hands began trembling as he processed the reality that his inheritance calculations had been based on completely false assumptions about the legal distribution of their mother's estate. Judge Hartford examined the adoption papers with the careful attention that such significant documents deserved, her experienced eyes scanning each page for evidence of fraud or procedural irregularities while the courtroom waited in absolute silence. The documents appeared to be authentic and properly executed, with all necessary signatures, seals, and filing confirmations that established their legal validity beyond question. Morrison's confident demeanor transformed into obvious confusion and growing panic as he realized that his assured victory had just become an unprecedented legal disaster for his high-profile clients. His silver hair seemed to wilt under the courtroom lights, and his expensive suit suddenly appeared inadequate to the magnitude of his professional embarrassment. "Your Honor," he stammered, clearly struggling to process the unexpected turn of events. "We were not informed of any such adoption proceedings and request time to verify these documents." Bradley's shock transformed into fury so intense that his face turned red with barely controlled rage, his steel-gray eyes blazing with the sort of entitled outrage that characterized someone unaccustomed to having his assumptions challenged by inconvenient facts. "This is impossible," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion and disbelief. Mother never mentioned any adoption. This has to be fraud, some kind of elaborate scam designed to steal our inheritance. His outburst earned immediate censure from Judge Hartford, whose brown eyes flashed with the sort of judicial authority that had silenced countless unruly defendants during her career on the bench. "Mr. Whitmore," she said sharply, "you will control yourself in my courtroom, or you will be removed and held in contempt. These are serious legal proceedings, not a family argument, and you will conduct yourself accordingly." Stephanie attempted to salvage the situation through her legal training, though her voice betrayed the shock that was undermining her professional confidence. "Your Honor," she said with obvious strain, "as a practicing attorney, I respectfully request that the court verify the authenticity and proper execution of these alleged adoption documents before proceeding with any inheritance determinations." Judge Hartford's response demonstrated both her legal expertise and her obvious irritation with the siblings' inability to accept the validity of properly executed court documents. "Ms. Whitmore-Chin," she said with judicial patience that barely concealed her annoyance, "these documents bear the seal and signature of Judge William Morrison from this very courthouse, dated 22 months ago. Unless you are prepared to present evidence of fraud or forgery, their validity is established by their official nature and proper filing." Connor's breakdown was complete and public, his carefully maintained professional image crumbling as he bolted from his seat and ran toward the courtroom exit, his expensive shoes clicking frantically against the marble floor as he fled from the reality that his mother had outmaneuvered him from beyond the grave. His departure created a buzz of conversation among the spectators, many of whom had followed his social media posts about property investments and business ventures. The judge's final pronouncement carried the weight of absolute legal authority, her words transforming Maria's status from displaced caregiver to legitimate heir with rights that could not be challenged or dismissed by her adoptive siblings. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said clearly, "as the legally adopted daughter of Margaret Whitmore, you possess inheritance rights equal to those of the biological children, and any attempts to remove you from the family property without proper legal proceedings constitute harassment and potential criminal trespass." Morrison's attempt to request a continuance for document verification was denied with judicial efficiency that demonstrated Judge Hartford's familiarity with desperate legal maneuvering from attorneys who had been out-prepared by more competent opposition. "The adoption is valid and binding," she announced firmly, "and these proceedings will continue with full recognition of Mrs. Rodriguez's legal standing as an equal heir to the estate." As the courtroom erupted in buzz of amazed conversation and reporters rushed to file stories about the most dramatic legal reversal in recent memory, Maria remained seated quietly beside David Chun, her dignity intact despite the chaos surrounding her. The justice that Margaret had planned so carefully was finally being delivered, and the children who had treated their mother's loyal companion with such casual cruelty were discovering that love and loyalty possessed power that transcended every assumption their wealth and privilege had taught them to take for granted. Bradley and St. Fanny sat in stunned silence among the wreckage of their legal confidence, their expensive clothing and professional credentials suddenly irrelevant in the face of documents that proved their mother had possessed wisdom, foresight, and determination that exceeded anything they had ever understood about her character or her capacity for strategic thinking. The drive back to the house on Elm Street felt like a journey through transformed landscape for Maria Elena Rodriguez, who now carried the legal adoption papers that had changed her from displaced caregiver to rightful heir in the span of a single courthouse revelation. The same tree-lined streets that had felt like a path to exile just days earlier now welcomed her home as Margaret Whitmore's legally recognized daughter, with inheritance rights that no amount of wealth or legal expertise could challenge or diminish. The house itself appeared unchanged from the outside, its stately brick facade and carefully maintained gardens showing no evidence of the legal earthquake that had just rearranged the family hierarchy with such dramatic finality. However, Maria knew that everything about her relationship to this place had been fundamentally altered by Margaret's secret planning and David Chin's masterful revelation of the adoption documents that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 years. The locks had indeed been changed as Bradley had threatened, But David Chin's phone call to the locksmith company had quickly resolved that minor obstacle once Maria's legal status as an equal owner was established through the probate court's official recognition. The irony of using her newfound authority to reclaim access to her own home was not lost on Maria, who remembered Margaret's promises about never being homeless again with new understanding of their practical legal foundation. Inside the house, evidence of the siblings' premature victory celebration was scattered throughout the rooms they had claimed as their inheritance headquarters. Stephanie's legal documents were spread across Margaret's writing desk. Connor's property appraisal materials cluttered the dining room table, and Bradley's inventory lists filled multiple notebooks with meticulous calculations of asset values and distribution percentages. The sight of their confident planning materials felt surreal now that their assumptions had been proven so spectacularly incorrect. The local news coverage of the courtroom revelation had exceeded even David Chin's expectations for public interest, with footage of Connor's panicked flight from the courthouse becoming viral video content that generated millions of views across social media platforms. The dramatic contrast between Bradley's arrogant social media posts about evicting Maria and the actual legal outcome had created a social media phenomenon that news outlets were calling one of the most satisfying legal reversals in recent memory. Bradley's professional reputation had suffered immediate and severe damage from the viral coverage of his courtroom humiliation, with several major clients of his investment firm requesting meetings to discuss their concerns about his judgment and decision-making capabilities. The video of his contempt-worthy outburst in Judge Hartford's courtroom had been shared extensively within the financial industry, where his colleagues expressed private amusement at his spectacular miscalculation of what he had assumed would be a simple legal formality. Stephanie faced even more serious professional consequences as the State Bar Association initiated preliminary review proceedings to determine whether her confident legal analysis of inheritance law, delivered so publicly through social media, constituted professional negligence or incompetent legal advice. Her partners at Morrison, Bradley and Associates were reportedly reconsidering her status within the firm, particularly after Morrison himself became the subject of professional mockery for losing such a high-profile case so completely. Connor's technology startup had experienced immediate investor concerns following the viral footage of his courtroom breakdown, with several venture capital firms withdrawing preliminary funding commitments based on questions about his emotional stability and business judgment. The professional image he had carefully cultivated through social media was destroyed overnight by video footage that showed him fleeing from legal proceedings like someone escaping a crime scene rather than participating in routine family business. The community response to the adoption revelation had been overwhelmingly supportive of Maria, with neighbors, local business owners, and Margaret's friends reaching out to express their satisfaction that justice had prevailed over entitlement and cruelty. Many people shared stories of their own observations about the contrast between Maria's devoted care for Margaret and the biological children's obvious absence during their mother's final years. Margaret's longtime physician, Dr. Sarah Williams, provided a particularly powerful statement to local news outlets about Maria's consistent presence at medical appointments and her detailed knowledge of Margaret's health conditions, contrasting this dedication with the biological children's minimal involvement in their mother's medical care. The doctor's professional validation of Maria's family role carried significant weight in public discussions about who had truly earned the right to be considered Margaret's daughter. The first direct contact between Maria and her adoptive siblings came exactly 1 week after the courthouse revelation, when David Chun informed her that Morrison's firm had requested a family meeting to discuss the terms under which the biological children might remain beneficiaries of Margaret's will rather than being disinherited completely for their treatment of their legally adopted sister. Margaret's will, as it turned out, contained carefully crafted language that made the biological children's inheritance contingent upon their acceptance of Maria as their legal sister and their public acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the adoption proceedings. The document, written with the same strategic foresight that had characterized the adoption process itself, gave Maria the power to determine whether her adoptive siblings would receive anything from the estate beyond minimal legal requirements. The family meeting took place in David Chin's conference room, a neutral location that prevented any of the siblings from claiming home field advantage while ensuring that professional mediation would be available if emotions overwhelmed rational discussion. The contrast between the participants' attitudes compared to their courthouse confidence just 1 week earlier was remarkable to observe, with the biological children displaying a humility and respect that had been completely absent from their previous interactions with Maria. Bradley arrived dressed in a modest business suit rather than his usual expensive designer clothing, his steel gray eyes lacking their former arrogance as he struggled to reconcile his new reality as someone seeking favor rather than dispensing judgment. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the condescending authority that had characterized his previous communications with Maria, replaced instead by the careful tone of someone who understood that his financial future depended upon the goodwill of the person he had tried so hard to humiliate. Stephanie's legal training had apparently helped her understand the gravity of their situation more quickly than her brother's, and her apology was delivered with the precision of someone who recognized that specific acknowledgments of wrongdoing would be required to satisfy the conditions Margaret had established for continued inheritance rights. She admitted to treating Maria disrespectfully, acknowledged the legitimacy of the adoption, and requested forgiveness for her assumption that legal expertise gave her the right to dismiss Maria's family bonds with Margaret. Connor's apology was perhaps the most genuine, delivered with the emotional rawness of someone whose public breakdown had forced him to confront aspects of his own character that he had never examined honestly. His recognition that his mother had possessed wisdom and strategic thinking that exceeded his own technological expertise seemed to genuinely surprise him, as if he was discovering Margaret's intelligence for the first time despite having been her son for 28 years. Maria's response to their apologies reflected the grace and dignity that Margaret had always admired in her chosen daughter, accepting their acknowledgments while establishing clear boundaries about future behavior and respect. She agreed to honor Margaret's wishes about maintaining family connections, while making it clear that any future disrespect or attempts to challenge her legal status would result in immediate disinheritance proceedings that would leave them with nothing beyond legal minimums. The financial arrangements that emerged from their negotiations reflected Maria's understanding of Margaret's desire to maintain family unity while ensuring that respect and appreciation were demonstrated through actions rather than empty words. The biological children would receive substantial but reduced inheritances, with the majority of Margaret's estate going to Maria as recognition of her years of devoted care and her new status as the primary heir. Maria's decision to remain in the family home was presented as a practical matter rather than an emotional victory, though she privately took satisfaction in knowing that Margaret's bedroom would continue to be maintained as a memorial to their shared years rather than being converted into a guest room or office space. The gardens they had planned together would continue to flourish under Maria's care, serving as a living tribute to the bond that had transcended the boundaries of traditional family relationships. The establishment of the Margaret Whitmore Memorial Garden became Maria's first major project as the family's primary heir, creating a community space where elder care volunteers could find respite and where Margaret's philosophy about chosen family versus biological relationships could be shared with others facing similar challenges. The garden's dedication ceremony attracted hundreds of community members who had been following the family's story through media coverage and social media discussions. Local television coverage of the garden dedication provided an opportunity for Maria to share Margaret's most important lesson about the difference between family and blood relationships, explaining how loyalty and love had proved more powerful than genetic connections or financial inheritance. Her interview emphasized forgiveness over revenge, though she made it clear that respect and acknowledgement had been necessary prerequisites for any family reconciliation. The broader community impact of their story extended beyond entertainment value to practical discussions about elder care, family relationships, and the legal protections available to caregivers who develop genuine bonds with the people they serve. Margaret's strategic use of adoption law to protect someone who had shown genuine love and devotion became a model that other estate attorneys began recommending to clients with similar family dynamics. As autumn turned to winter and the first anniversary of Margaret's death approached, Maria found herself reading the final entry in Margaret's journal, discovered in a safe deposit box that had been mentioned in the adoption paperwork, but not opened until all legal proceedings were complete. The entry was dated just 3 days before Margaret's death, written in handwriting that was shaky but determined, conveying final thoughts that seemed intended specifically for Maria's eventual discovery. Margaret's final words to her chosen daughter expressed satisfaction with the legal arrangements she had made and confidence that justice would prevail over cruelty when the adoption was revealed. She wrote about the joy she had found in Maria's companionship during her final years, contrasting this genuine love with the obligation and impatience that had characterized her biological children's interactions with her during the same period. The journal entry concluded with Margaret's prediction that her biological children would eventually come to understand the difference between inheritance and family, between legal requirements and genuine love, between the relationships that money could buy and the bonds that were built through daily kindness and mutual respect. Her final sentence expressed hope that all of her children, biological and chosen, would eventually learn to value what truly mattered in family relationships. 1 year later, as Maria tended the memorial garden that had become a symbol of chosen family throughout their community, she reflected on Margaret's final gift and the wisdom that had protected love from the destruction that selfishness and entitlement might have caused. The house on Elm Street remained a home rather than a commodity, filled with memories that honored the bond between two women who had understood that family meant far more than shared genetics or inherited wealth. Margaret Whitmore's final lesson about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family had been delivered with the precision of a master strategist and the heart of someone who understood that the most important inheritances cannot be measured in financial terms, but in the relationships that sustain us through life's most challenging moments.